Thank you very much. So I'm going to say right now, I'm an industrial designer, and I'm kind of a technological inept at that. So IoT is not my area of expertise, but I know IoT is physical, and the hardware is my area of expertise, not that much the hardware, like physical production. And I focused to sustainability. This is very basic stuff, the definition of sustainability from the Brundtland definition, and we were talking about back then the triple bottom line, social, environmental, and economic, or the people, profit, planet, to say. And this discussion is, of course, an ethical discussion. And it's been moved forward in the 90s to say, okay, but we really should be talking about strong sustainability, because we're not going to have an economy if we don't have a society. We don't have a society if we don't have an environment to have it in. And this is one line within sustainability that proposes that this is kind of a hierarchical relation between these three aspects. But it's still discussed if this is the case, because there are proponents that say, but artificial environments are as valid as natural environments. So yeah, we'll build a Death Star and I'll live on it. So it's kind of like if artificial or human-made environments and spaces are the same thing, which is an interesting debate, but anyway. In my line, I advocate for the strong sustainability approach. And moving even further, but this is just a few years ago, the UN came together with the Agenda for Sustainable Development, the famous SDG goals. They got very well assessed by some graphical designers, and you've seen this everywhere. They've made a little logo, people have pins. It's the stuff that we should be talking about, because it brings down this abstract sustainability to very concrete things. And here, going back to the ethics, when we say, okay, we're doing product development. If your product development can be associated to any of these goals directly, you're doing a good job. You are in line with what the world has decided we should be moving forward to. If you're not, well, at least as long as you're not attacking any of these, then, if you're not hindering any of these goals in taking place, then okay, maybe we're interested in what you want to propose. But when we combine the strong sustainability with the sustainable development goals, you get what they're calling the wedding cake model. Basically, you have 4 aspects that are tied to the environment down here. Then you have most of the aspects in the Sustainable Development Goals are social goals, and then the economy as the top of the cherry of the cake, so to say. And so if we're going to question which of these goals should we not be undermining, I would start from the bottom of the cake. So be sure that you're not going against this bit, and then we're good. But hopefully you're also contributing to some of them. And one of the things about the Sustainable Development Goals that always comes up is they're all interlinked. You can't do one against another. When you look at things like food or even products, like connected products, so on, they might have relation to what water is being used, the land that's being used, but also is there gender equality in the production facility, or so on and so forth. So these aspects really cover and are very intertwined and are very difficult to separate, or impossible to separate, I would say, almost. That said, when we relate this to design, we go back to these 3 aspects and we say, okay, we're doing something. Economic sustainability is a classic old question. Do we earn money making this? Yes or no? How much does it cost? How much can we sell it for? Are we in business? That's what we've learned to do very well, so we don't have to cover that. It's fine. We move along. Social sustainability, what are the social benefits that this does bring? And here we go back to Esther's presentation, because you have a product purpose, but there's ramifications and all these unintended things that happened with the technology that you're putting out there. is very interesting. And just reflecting about how products that have been developed historically have had implications in society that you would have never imagined is the stuff of sci-fi. And I recommend everybody in this field to read a lot of sci-fi because it is kind of the way we're going. And then in environmental sustainability, which is what sustainable design is more about, is how is the environment affected by us doing this? So the classical approach has been to avoid negative impact, so minimizing the pollution, et cetera. But then it's also, another trend has been, let's make positive impact. We can actually make things that reduce the carbon footprint on the planet, that make more biodiversity, and so on and so forth. So those are kind of the approaches. And this might sound super big, but there's a lot of tools associated for that. And one of the key tools within sustainable design is life cycle thinking. To the point that the UN, the UNEP, the environmental program, has supported this life cycle initiative to get everybody on board and thinking, okay, you're doing a product and you're not just thinking about your end user that is doing this here and now, but you also have to be thinking of where you're getting your raw materials, what is happening in design and production, how are you distributing this, and then the use and maintenance, and actually what happens after disposal. And life cycle, depending on which flavor of life cycle analysis you use, the stages have different names, but this is basically the main stages. And suddenly it seems a lot to ask a designer to also think about, you know, the social inequality at the production factory for one of the materials that they have. So it gets very overwhelming very quickly. But fortunately enough, there's a lot of smart people that have put the things together and basically done databases of environmental impacts of production of different materials. So this app, IDEMAT, has, it's a long story. The life cycle assessment tools use environmental kind of damage as a parameter to rank these different products, but then they give it in a unit that either is CO2 emissions or water eutrophication or something like that. And this one combines several of them, but it also does it in money rather than giving you like kilos of CO2 emitted or something like that. And they do that. There is a web page called Eco Cost Value Ratio that explains all the details. But the benefit of doing that is that I can suddenly bring the environmental cost of making the project into my production budget and say, okay, we're going to sell this for this much, but we're generating this much damage that we'll eventually have to pay to clean up. And that's how they calculate the cost. How would you remediate this environmental impact? Super interesting work, but also super available. It's open source. It's just to look it up and kind of start nerding out and learn about materials, basically, which I find is interesting. And then, well, my PhD thesis focused on waste management and how to bridge the gap between end-of-life disposal to new production. And basically, in the concluding reflections, I come to, okay, you have two ways of dealing with the waste that is being generated. You can either plan to recirculate it, so like these PET bottles here, we'll recycle this, we'll just take it back. And if you plan it, it can be recirculated, but it can also fail to be recirculated. And you have to acknowledge the fact that you plan for a highly complex situation. You design something in one place, it's produced in the other edge of the world, it's used everywhere, and it's disposed everywhere. So you can't really say, oh no, but in Europe they will, sort it this way and the recycling this way. Yeah, but you're on a trip, or it'll make its way out to the gutter and to the sea in the end anyway. So you have to kind of accept the fact that you can plan, but you can fail. And then there's also the fact that you can have improvised recirculation. So something that wasn't planned in the beginning can happen. And this is the Mosier lamp, or the liter of light that they call it. It's a Brazilian inventor that basically put water in these bottles and sticks half of it on top, and with the reflection, it generates light indoors, equal to a 60, 80 watt bulb. And it's very simple, and in a way has more value than the bottle itself. Yep. So it's basically a plastic bottle of water, and so you make a hole in a roof, like a tin metal roof, and you have half of the bottle on top, and then you seal it there. You put a little bit of chlorine so the algae won't build, and then the reflection of the water generates the light indoors. But not at night. Yeah, but of course it has its limitations, but for rural areas around the world, it has been a success. And also because it was like, this is simple, we can just all do it, it generated a huge kind of activity around this liter of light projects and so on that have reached, you know, the corners, rural corners of the world. And what I want to say with this example is that improvised recirculation sometimes brings even more value than what you put into it. So there is, again, an ethical dilemma here. If we plan to recirculate and the companies are the owners, then you're cutting out everybody else that wants to recirculate with that material. And that is something that I find very dystopian. And we're going into corporate futures and blah, blah, blah. And I think we need to allow for improvised manufacturing because the value can be improved. Not because we don't want to plan for it to be recirculated, but we should all have the right to do what we want with the stuff that is around or available. Yes, on that note, I think it's the tag team time. No, okay, one more. This is the hard cookie. So because I focused on waste, when people that are not within the waste management field talk about waste, they think, okay, the product that I'm doing after it's been used is going to be thrown away. But that is only the tip of the iceberg. Here. The other two waste streams, waste from extraction and waste from manufacturing, are actually much bigger and are actually the main environmental impact. The problem is that the municipal waste, or the waste after use, is the most complex stream. So it's there where we have everything mixed. We don't know how to kind of get a hold of what is value there. In the earlier stages, the volume is much bigger, but they're a certain type of waste, so it's more accessible to try to recirculate. A professor once made the analogy, it's like making a fruit salad, mashing everything up, serving it up, and somebody saying, no, I just want a banana. And it's like, oh, okay. So basically that's what we do with the waste system, and then we want to pick it up at the end, and it doesn't really work that way. So yeah, that was the last image from me. Over to Chris.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. So hopefully now some of us should have some kind of like vocabulary or way to talk about some of the things related to like sustainability and like basically the ethics of IoT. At ThingsCon in December, we actually ran an event called Designing Out Waste, where we were started talking about the tale of, well, basically some of these ideas. So, okay, there's a Nokia phone here, and I've got a Fairphone here, all right? And these are basically like more or less kind of the same kind of phones, all right? But you'll see, as I mentioned here, there's costs here, there's this idea of eco-costs, and there's this idea of value, right? And generally, if the value is higher than the costs, we're doing okay. And that's kind of how we think of things like, say, Nokia's, which is cool, right? But the downside is there's a kind of degree of intergenerational violence in some of this, right, that we kind of have to talk about. And you do see attempts to actually address some of this. So the Fairphone, that's more like this bit here, where they try to take into account all these other costs, right? The result of this is that this is about 500 euros for a phone which is 2 years old, which is two or 3 years old now. This is like 230 euros, right? And like these are, I think these sound like kind of ethical issues if we're basically shifting the cost onto people who are unable to really bear this stuff. And the nice thing is there are actually some tools that we can actually use to assess the kind of products we create to see, well, what can we change about this? And this is one thing that we actually showed during the workshop, in the Designing Out Waste workshop. This is called a material, energy, and toxicity matrix. So as Isabel was talking about the various stages that you have, so getting raw materials out, designing of it, packaging, and so on, we can think about that, but we can also think about the kind of inputs and outputs from this. So let's say I'm making a phone, this one here or this one here. So this is made of plastic, right? So how much energy has gone into actually getting the plastic in the first place, as opposed to, like, say, milling aluminium or things like that. We can talk about, say, the getting it out of the ground. We can talk about the energy needed for making this kind of stuff, because we know that, say, aluminium is quite energy intensive. And we could talk about the toxicity, because at the end of life, you might be able to recycle, say, aluminium, for example, but plastic, maybe we know, if it's a kind of particular kind of plastic, then that's not going to be great. And like, we can basically look through the entire stage here. So let's say we're thinking about, okay, 2 different phones here, and we're thinking, well, maybe we could think about how we would reduce the impact at the packaging pile, right? Maybe we could ship this, like literally ship it, rather than fly things, for example. I'm not saying Nokia flies this stuff. They both actually use air freight for the purpose of getting this stuff around. But this is actually a framework that we can use. And what we did for the workshop was actually look at a juicer, because it was relatively simple and you can take them apart quite easily. And we started looking at like how complicated these things are. And what you're looking at here is basically a kind of online remote workshop for this. But we had this as a kind of printable worksheet for people to work through, and we tested this a few times. And yeah, well, if we just think about something like a juicer, we've got multiple kinds of plastic, multiple kinds of rare earth minerals. There's all these things that we're having to think about here. And like, you probably can't see too much of it on here, but so I'll read some of it out to you. But like, when we're thinking about just the extraction of raw materials, there's all this stuff here, and we only think about, say, even at the end of this, right? So there's going to be all these issues related to like the toxicity from getting this stuff out the ground. So we might have a small amount of minerals, but we end up creating all these kind of piles of extra kind of tailings and things from getting this stuff out to the ground, for example. And like, you can basically use something like this to ask yourself some particular questions about the products you're building, and that essentially you have some degree of responsibility for as a professional, right? And I can read some of these out. So like, if you're thinking about, say, on just energy alone, because we know that right now most of our energy comes from burning fossil fuels. So like, how much energy is used to get the materials you have? How much energy is used to like in the manufacturing processes? So how much energy is it to actually transport some of this stuff? So that these are all kind of considerations you can take into account. And like, the idea is that if you have something like a matrix like this, you can basically start deciding where you're looking at where some of your hotspots might actually be, and then look at the kind of strategies you can actually apply to reduce some of the damage there. So this is one thing that we've been using, and this is actually based on, this is coming out of academia. But the nice thing is that there are more tools like this. And in the UK, there's a whole load of people talking about this, because I was at a tech ethics conference in January, and one of the questions came up. And the question was basically, are we the bad guys? Because there is this idea that, well, we're in this kind of structural system right now, and we seem to be doing okay, and there's lots of other people who are not necessarily doing so well out of this. And the thing that came out of this work, which I found really interesting, was this notion of an event called consequence scanning. There's a lady called Emily Webber who was working with .everyone, the organization, and another lady called Sam Brown who was working on this. And basically what they did was they, at this event, we did a prototype event. I mean, we ran through their prototype event. So just like if you're building digital products, you might have like a retrospective, or you might plan for a week of time. The idea was that you'd have an event where you could actually ask some of the questions, basically take a bit of time to, I guess, reflect on what you're actually doing. And this is the stuff they came up with, which I found really, really interesting, and I wanted to share with you folks, because it asks some questions that you might not actually ask in the process of building things. So the questions were, so, okay, what are the intended consequences of what we're building? What are the unintended consequences? And who are these for? So you can have something which is really, really good for, say, consumers, and it might be kind of good for someone as an individual, but it might have some effects, unintended consequences on society. So, okay, who here uses Airbnb? Has used Airbnb before? All right. Now, who here has seen rent go up in Berlin over the last 5 years, right? Like, we can plot this stuff now, yeah? And then let's say you're thinking about like Uber, for example, and then we've got like workers here, and like there are ways that we can actually have somewhat kind of more useful conversations, or ways you can prompt ourselves in teams to then say, well, okay, we didn't mean this to happen. Are we going to do something about it? Are we actually going to act upon it? Like, you can actually do some things like this, and I really, really would recommend looking at this. This has been one of the most useful tools I've seen so far to allow you to do this. And like we did in January, the basically prototype of this event was pretend you're working for Airbnb, then talk about the intended consequences and the unintended consequences. And we had a really, really useful session. You could talk about what you were going for. You could actually, and this is like designed to be like an hour-long event that you might do in a team building a digital product or a digital service. And this stuff is actually available to download for free. It's really, really new. It just came out a few weeks ago. But it's actually, I find it very, very accessible. And it does force you to actually think about some of the questions that you might only talk about in the pub afterwards, or outside of office, and think, oh, well, I guess it's structure. We can't do something. Well, I think that we owe it to ourselves and to future generations to do a bit more than that. And I think some of these tools can actually help in that. And I think the reason I'm talking about this is because I think there was a gentleman here who mentioned this idea that we do want to talk about this. And I think actually Esther mentioned there are people who are working as IoT developers saying, well, I want to do something, but I don't know how to have this conversation with people. And I think that if you actually do think about this and you want like stuff like this to be cheaper than something like this, then maybe we can talk about some of this, and maybe we can do something here. Now, there is an event in September, so if you are working with IoT, which is run by the Runde Tischreparatur, basically the round table for repair, right? This is an event in September, which is run by a number of organizations, and in particular, some people related to the Restart project are actually talking about, okay, how do we design things, and how do we actually collect some of the data so we can actually have a productive conversation with, say, policymakers? Because for the longest time, it's been really, really hard to actually have the data that you can present to policymakers and say, look, well, okay, this is the current system, but this is these are the problems we're having with the current thing, where we have a very linear approach, where basically you dig things out of the ground, and then a few months or a year later, or not that long, it ends up in a landfill or ends up being burnt, or I was going to say sent to China, but it doesn't even get sent to China anymore, because China have changed their own policy now. So now it ends up in, say, Ghana or in Africa. And what's happening now, my friends, is that in, say, there's a fantastic story in The Guardian right now, where the kind of end of life for this stuff gets sent over there, and then people kind of grow. They have like chickens and things like that, which might, say, be on the kind of trash heaps that people are actually using. And then those eggs end up back in Europe. So we end up eating eggs with 220 times the safe amount of dioxins and things, because we're not addressing this, because we don't have ways to talk about this stuff right now. And I really think it's worth doing, because, well, yeah, we don't have very long, really. And like, I don't know about you, but the idea of a dioxin omelette doesn't sound very exciting to me. But this is happening in September. And if you are interested in this, please do make a note of FixFest 2019. I'm really looking forward to it. If you actually think about some of the more kind of systemic issues, I'm organizing an event called OMG Climate at the end of this month. Because if any of you work in technology, you'll notice that maybe we should be talking about this more, because we don't talk about it very much. So what we're doing is we're creating an unconference where you come along and you say, hey, I'd like some help thinking about this and talking about this issue with some other people. So you've got experts, people who are like industrial designers and ethicists, and people who understand the climate science and stuff like that, to say, well, let's come up with some constructive ways to actually have conversations at work, because no one else is coming. Like, it's down to us, and we really need to do something. And I think that's what, I don't have a thank you page, I'm so sorry. So this is just it. So yeah, this is us. And hopefully the language that Isabel has actually shared with you, and some ways of using that language to have productive conversations, are the key takeaways you've got from this. And I guess, should we open the floor to questions? Yeah, all right. Okay.